All right, well, Andrew Bridgen MP, thank you for joining us. So this is the Based podcast, and we always have people who are highly based on, so you certainly fit the credentials there, I can tell you. You've qualified comfortably after your last 12 years, but last two and a half, 3 years in particular. So thanks for coming on. How's the weather down there or up there in your part of the world?
It's changeable. It's very warm the last 2 days, but it was down to 5 degrees at the weekend up in the Midlands in my constituency and further north.
Yeah.
But down in London today and yesterday, it's been remarkably mild.
You're the MP, and you have been since 2010 for Northwest Leicestershire. What's the area like? Tell us a little bit about your electorate.
It's the only hilly part of Leicestershire. Leicestershire's generally gently undulating. It did have the most deprived town in Leicestershire, which was Coalville, within it, a gritty former mining town. One of my grandfathers was a coal miner, and basically since 2010, we've converted the poorest part of Leicestershire into the richest. So we've got lots of, using my business contacts, we've got lots of economic growth. We've got the highest economic growth in the UK. We've got 1.2 jobs in the constituency now for everyone of working age. So we're a massive importer of labour. And I sussed out that what we wanted to do was, people want to make people happy. And for most people, being happy is being able to get a job that's reasonably well paid, get a partner who can get a job that's reasonably well paid, buy a house, pay the bills, go on holiday and have a night out now and again. It's not too much to ask, and we've delivered it. So we built enough houses to keep the house prices down. And because of the economic growth, we're now the only part of Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland that's got above UK average salaries. So we're in the sweet spot. And it wasn't surprising that having taken the seat from the Socialists in 2010, our majority went up at every election. We were the happiest place to live in the Midlands on the happiness index just before the 19 election. And despite there being 6 candidates on the ballot paper, I got 63% of all the votes in the last general election.
And what about coming in 2010? Because you were elected in 2010 with the Conservative Party. What was the margin like at that point? Was it less?
Yes, I got in with 45% of the vote and a 7,500 majority. That went up in 15 to 11,200 majority and about 55% of the vote. And it went up again to 13,300 in the 2017 disastrous election called by Theresa May. My majority still went up to 13,300, and now it stands at in 2019 it was 20,400.
Yeah, the reason I ask is because here in Australia there are numerous examples of Conservative MPs taking seats on a slender margin, sticking true to their values and Conservative principles, and increasing that margin against the natural course of understanding. So it strikes me that might have been your experience as well. I expect over the time, from what I understand of your career, you've probably been pretty forthright about your views and stood firm on them. If the COVID period tells us anything, it'd show us that. So I mean, that's the sort of the lesson from this is, people, we call them the quiet Australians in this country,
The government embarked on carrying on a Labour policy from pre-2010, which is something called High Speed 2, to build this high-speed, very expensive railway track around the country. And I voted against it on principle it was going to get out of control. My constituency would have gone right through for 22 miles, right through the middle of my constituency. And basically, I told my constituents more than 10 years ago that this is going to be a project's going to get out of control. It's never going to get built, and it's just going to cause a lot of blight. And of course, the government eventually, after a decade, agreed and closed the project down. But it had done untold damage to the constituency. I'm also I was one of the very first MPs to stand up for the sub-postmasters over the Horizon scandal 14 years ago, within weeks of being elected. And I've been vindicated on that. I also exposed the modern slavery in the garment, the fast fashion industry in Leicester, and I was vindicated on that. And now I'm standing up for the vaccine harms and the excess deaths. And unfortunately, I'm going to be vindicated on that as well. And that's pretty damning for the government and for all of our parliament who went along with draconian lockdowns, mandates for experimental, untested medications, and has done untold harm to our nation.
Yeah, and I mean, I heard that story. You came into politics on the back of that Postal Horizon or Post Office Horizon scandal, which became popularised in an English TV show, I think. But it wasn't so at the time, was it? Just a bit of background on that, because it's a good intro into politics, fighting for a cause like that, I suppose.
Well, it was unfortunate for the government that my constituent from Ibstock, where we create a lot of bricks are manufactured in Ibstock because we're an old coal mining area, so we've got the clay. Michael Rudkin was the representative for all the sub-postmasters in the UK. He and his wife ran the sub-post office in Ibstock in my constituency, and he was immortalised in the ITV drama documentary because he, while representing all the sub-postmasters in the UK, visited Fujitsu, who maintained and created the Horizon software that was used by the post office. He visited their headquarters at Bracknell in 2008 and was accidentally shown them altering live data down in the basement due to faults in the Horizon system. And he returned home. Well, when they found out who he actually was, they threw him out of the building. He drove back to Ibstock, and mysteriously the next morning, he and his wife got a visit from the post office inspectors claiming that there'd been a £40,000 shortfall on the computer, i.e. accusing them of stealing £40,000 from their own sub-post office overnight on the same day that he had uncovered everything. They were discredited, they were criminalised, and he came to me. As soon as I was elected in 2010, I picked up that issue, and it was almost like a conspiracy theory that the state had colluded to keep this secret and to criminalise him and his wife wrongly. And the more I looked into it, Mr. Rudkin was telling the truth. And of course, years later, after I got the Parliament, I got the government to approve a contact of mine, Ron Warmington, at a forensic accountant's firm called Second Sight, to investigate the Post Office Horizon system. And I argued with the government at the time because I said, look, the government said we're going to make the Post Office pay for their own investigation. And I maintained that that was a false idea, because the moment that the investigators found anything, the Post Office, because they were paying them, were going to seek to shut down the investigation. And unfortunately for the sub-postmasters and for the government, that's exactly what happened. But Ron Warmington was a man of great moral courage. And despite the threats from the post office, he leaked to me the unredacted evidence of what the Horizon system was really about and all the glitches in it. And he was even threatened with litigation by the post office to try and silence him, but he wouldn't keep quiet. And as I say, the rest is history. But as far as the TV series program was concerned, which went pretty viral around the world, if you go back to Parliament in 2014-15, everything that was in that television program I had documented and spoken about at length in the chamber of the House of Commons, but no one had acted upon it. And it's the biggest miscarriage of justice by false criminalisation in the UK's history. It's probably around about 1,000 people were wrongly convicted. And it's taken a long time to get justice. We actually moved the legislation forward for an en masse removal of criminal charges, which is unprecedented in the UK, given the numbers, to overturn. Because normally you have to return to court to get a criminal conviction overturned. We're using special legislation to en masse take the criminal charges and convictions away from all of these sub-postmasters so that they can move on and get the compensation they deserve. But it's tremendously slow. And it's almost as if you can never beat the system, because rather like many other compensation schemes for government mistakes, it's like running through porridge. And they always say that we want to speed all this up and speed all this up, but Mrs. Rudkin was one of the first 9 sub-postmasters back in December 2020 to have her criminal conviction legally overturned in a court. But I'll tell you now that Mr. and Mrs. Rudkin still haven't had their full compensation 4 years on from that. And that's a travesty. And that flies in the face of everything the government's saying about wanting to bring this speedily to a conclusion. It is almost like no one can ever beat the system. Even when you prove that they're wrong, you don't win. And no one can bring back the 16 years of misery that Mr. and Mrs. Rudkin have suffered. And they're both suffering ill health now, and I'm convinced that this is largely down to the stress that they've been put under. I did manage, when I picked up the case in 2012, I managed to stop the post office from repossessing their house, at least.
Enormous
it's a travesty.
Enormous impost on people's lives, and it does make people cynical about the political process. I mean, you've heard those complaints, I'm sure, as I have. What is your view changed over the course of that time when you came into politics and you saw how the system, you thought how the system worked to now? I mean, have you found yourself sort of a bit more reluctant about the way the speed and the sort of the way in which the party system works, and the Conservative Party in the UK, has it changed?
Yes, I think it has. I think I've changed too. I was an extremely successful businessman in northwest Leicestershire. It's my home. They're the people I've grown up with, and it was, in my view, going the wrong direction. And myself and a group of other small business people locally decided we wanted to do something about it. So they all stood for the local council. The council had been under basically Labour control all of its history, which is coterminous with my constituency. And we took that in 2007, and I said I'd stand for the MP in a seat which the Conservative Party said you could never win, by the way. And so they didn't really give me any money. I'd used my own money for the leaflets and the campaign, and that was fine. And of course, we won with the second biggest swing in the country against Labour in 2010 and built it up from there. But I came into politics to make things, I hoped, better for my constituents and the country. And we should be passing laws to make people more prosperous, safer and happier, better educated. And I think what we've moved now to, I was slapped pretty much wide awake by the overreach of government during the COVID tyranny. And I realised what was going on, and it was not the science by any stretch of the imagination. And I think we've moved now to a position where the people are scared of what the government's going to inflict upon them next, and that is a very bad state of affairs. I think there's a quote from a left-wing politician, but a great Democrat, Tony Benn, and he said that when the people are scared of the politicians, that's tyranny. But when the politicians are scared of the people, that's democracy. And we need to get back to the latter as soon as possible. And it's amazing what I'm seeing is that, strange decisions made by the UK government have sort of been mirrored as if we're in lockstep around the developed world, making the same bizarre decisions, whether that's around the response to a airborne respiratory virus that had a survival rate of 99.8% at least, whether it's around this ludicrous trans agenda that's infecting Western democracies, or whether it's about net zero, which is another conundrum. So why a government would want to make its people poorer, colder, and less free, and think people are going to vote for it. But of course, we've got this uniparty system where on all the big issues, all the political parties amazingly agree, and there is no credible opposition.
And I mean, actually, you of course came to prominence here in Australia mostly for the COVID period, and I certainly watched from afar at another fellow traveller in the COVID space, I suppose, who was raising questions about some of the government overreach. But and of course, you were also a member of the government that was in power at the time. What was the moment for you when the penny dropped on that timeline? You know, you started to speak out, but what was the thing that pressed the light switch on for you about COVID?
Well, the creeping doom of eminent scientists being cancelled for speaking against the narrative, and people saying that the science is settled, which they also say about net zero. Well, I mean, as someone who's got a science degree, interestingly, was in biological sciences, specialising in biochemistry, genetics, virology, and behaviour. I know that the science is never settled. Science always has to be up for debate and new theses and hypotheses put forward, and saying that the science is ever settled, that's a red flag straight away. And seeing so many eminent scientists with nothing to gain for telling their truth other than being attacked, losing their jobs, their positions at universities, their funding for their research, I mean, that is some testament to the truth that they believe they're saying, and they should never be cancelled. So there was that. During the COVID pandemic, I was very uncomfortable about the lockdowns. I voted against lots of them. I watched the suicide rate in my constituency rocket during those lockdowns. We were having more people committing suicide in a month than we normally had in a year. And it was almost as if they were collateral damage to promoting the government policies through unwarranted fear for a virus that was not that dangerous at all. So that festered for a while, and I voted against Plan B and the mandatory masking, and the mandates on NHS staff taking the vaccines the previous Christmas. But when the MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency, petitioned the government for authorisation for the experimental jabs for small children down from 5 years of age to 6 months, I just felt obliged that I had to speak out. There's really not a healthy child in the world who's died from COVID-19. And I knew there'd be a huge political backlash against me for going against the narrative, but I believed it was an argument I could win, that even the most pro-vax of the public would realise that you could demonstrate there was no risk, minuscule risk to these young children, but there was a risk from the vaccine itself. And I made that point in a speech in the Chamber of the House of Commons on the 13th of December 2022, and I was immediately cancelled. But what I can tell you, Alex, is that the UK never authorised those vaccines for those small children, and that was worth it. I was then suspended for a tweet which I was alleged to be anti-Semitic by retweeting a paper from Dr. Josh Getchko of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who happens to be a Jewish gentleman, with the line that I'd been told by a world-leading cardiologist that the rollout of the experimental vaccines is the biggest crime against humanity since the Holocaust. I was suspended. I had various meetings. It was clear it was a complete stitch-up. And in the last meeting I had with the grandee of the party, who was acting as the go-between, I was told, having raised all my concerns around the safety efficacy of the vaccines and also what happened to our vulnerable elderly in hospital with the midazolam and morphine scandal, at the end of an hour and a half meeting, I was calmly told by him, Andrew, there is currently no political appetite for your views on the vaccines. There may well be in 20 years' time, and you're probably going to be proven right. But in the meantime, you need to bear in mind you're taking on the most powerful vested interest in the world with all the personal risk for you which that will entail. And I said, I think this meeting's over. I'm out of here. And I was out of the party at that point. And the more I look at these things, I did some research. And obviously, Nurse Sparrow in Australia was absolutely crucial in exposing the thalidomide scandal in the early 60s. Thalidomide was bought in by a company from Germany called Chemi Grünenthal. It was suspended in 1961 due to the birth abnormalities. 60% of the children, of the unborn babies died, and 40% were born with life-changing problems. And researching the history of that, I found that it was 1972 before the word thalidomide was allowed to be mentioned in the Chamber of the House of Commons. Grünenthal had got an injunction on newspapers in the UK who just couldn't cover the story about the harms that medication had done. That was lifted following the ruling of a Strasbourg human rights court, and the three judges there, in their judgment, considered that successive speakers of the House of Commons had deliberately suppressed all debate and questions about thalidomide for 11 years. And as I stood up in a debate earlier this year and pointed out to the Speaker that I wasn't going to let that happen again.
And what's your view, therefore, on this recent round? I mean, I've always taken the view that it will take time for people to become acclimatised and, for whatever reason, for the story to really come out and be accepted. But do you take the same view, or do you think this will come out quicker, or do you think it will be a longer burn?
Well, I hope it's not 20 years. We haven't got 20 years. Goodness knows what could be inflicted on the people in that time. I don't think they're going to get 20 months from when they told me that. I think it's going to come out later this year. It's coming out now. You've got AstraZeneca now having to admit that their experimental vaccine may have caused rare blood clotting. It's not rare. 1 in 800 severe adverse events is not rare. I spoke out I think it was in March last year. And I quoted the government's own figures from number needed to vaccinate of the booster campaign for the safety and efficacy of that. And the government figures divided the population up into 10-year demographics and also two groups, healthy and at risk, so those with comorbidities. And I think in the 40 to 49-year-old healthy category, bear in mind that the booster was being offered free to every age group, above 5 years of age. In the healthy age group 40 to 49, it was 994,000 people had to be boosted just to keep one person out from presenting in hospital with a case of COVID-19. And when you think that 1 in 800 will have a severe adverse event from the vaccine themselves, which can include death, you're looking at 1,150 people being hospitalized or killed by a vaccine to keep one person from presenting with symptoms of COVID. Not going into intensive care, mind you. That was a lot more than 994,000 to do that. That was just to stop someone presenting at the doctors with COVID. And again, the government said I was a conspiracy theorist, but within 3 weeks they lifted the criteria to a minimum age of 75 for the booster within 3 weeks. So I think I have been effective in changing government policy because it gets things on the record and people will be held to account for this. I think this is the biggest medical scandal in history around the world, and people are going to wake up to what's being perpetrated against them, because until we do that, we're not. The harms are continuing. The boosters are still being recommended and pushed out. And the first step to sorting out any problem has got to be admitting you've got a problem. We're not even at stage 1 yet. And there's much we could do to help those who have been harmed by these experimental treatments. And we need to get on and start doing that research and doing it.
Yeah, and there's been sort of as you say, wading through porridge-like approach to this through the parliaments. We've tried here in Australia to get a number of different inquiries up. We have a government inquiry in foot, but it's completely inadequate. It doesn't look to any of the key data points, and but you do have one in the United Kingdom. It's been going through the various stages, and it's stopped. It's somehow blockaded at Module 4. But just tell me a bit about the inquiry so far and what it's doing, and has it done any good? Does it look to be getting any information on the record?
No, it's come under great criticism by academics for being predetermined. It would appear that the Hallett inquiry, Baroness Hallett from the House of Lords is chairing an inquiry, that the only questions are whether we should have locked down harder and faster, which is fairly devastating. My debate 2 weeks ago, I think it was the 18th of April, the first full debate on the pandemic response and excess deaths. I led that debate and I did get the motion passed. Well, it was unopposed, so it went through, calling on the Hallett review in the UK to swiftly move on to opening Module 4 and look at the safety and efficacy of the vaccines and other therapeutics, which could involve why ivermectin and hydrochloroquine weren't used as early treatments, and also the midazolam and morphine scandal, which I think will end up showing that a large number of our vulnerable elderly in the UK and around the world were euthanized early on in the COVID pandemic response, leading to an increase in fear and pushing people to have this untested therapeutic, which is pretty damning. Because it's an independent inquiry, we can't force them to do anything. But it was very telling that they were due to open Module 4 into the safety and efficacy of the vaccines and therapeutics, but decided unilaterally that they were going to delay it until at least January next year, which will be after the next general election. The problem is, Alex, there's a huge amount of political capital on all sides of the House have been expended on the Parliament acted in the best interests of the public during the pandemic, and they're really very keen on keeping a lid on all dissent and critical thinking around this issue and public awareness of what's been perpetrated until after the next general election.
Yeah. And it does sort of, to a certain extent, does highlight the problem with modern politics in the West, doesn't it? Where you do have this, almost, I guess, retrospective look at what people did during that period and therefore what they're willing to pick over now. We have been pushed, a group of us have been pushing in Australia for a royal commission, a proper royal commission with proper powers. And in fact, we've just had a Senate inquiry, which has recommended a pretty broad-ranging one, but we're not holding our breath. We don't think that the Labor government here in particular are going to be, very fond of what it might bring up. So it's a real problem with the machine of politics, I think. And were there others in your, around you, anyone around you that sort of, also took a stand at any level, or were you the only real one?
There are a few MPs willing to talk about better compensation for those who've been vaccine harmed. And lots of MPs, well, not lots, probably 20 or 30 have been to see me privately over the last 12 months from across the political spectrum and said, "You're definitely onto something, Andrew, keep going." But that's a million miles, Alex, from being willing to stand up next to you in the chamber of the House of Commons and ask questions and hold the government to account. I mean, I've been cancelled and attacked, smeared in the media, following my expulsion from the Conservative Party. And half of that was to punish me for having the temerity to speak up for the people. And the other half was to scare the other politicians and point out what's going to happen to you if you do speak out. And quite honestly, it's worked. I mean, I've had senior politicians come to me who've admitted that after the second Pfizer jab, they had 2 micro heart attacks. Despite their own personal experience, they won't speak out. I had another senior politician came to me last summer and said that a very close relative of theirs had taken the Moderna booster and was now paralyzed from the neck down. And I said, well, I'm really sorry to hear that, but you've got to speak out now, And they said they weren't speaking out. And if they wouldn't do it for their own close relative, they're not doing it for their constituents. I mean, it's appalling, really. But I can see, they're scared. And we're supposed to speak without fear or favour. If we can't do that in the chamber of the House of Commons or in your chambers, what sort of democracy do we really have?
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And you talk about, obviously there's a political cost, but there must have been a personal cost to this as well. It's very, it's a harrowing experience having it. Did you find, particularly in the crucible of battle at the time during COVID, were friends different to you? Were you sort of looked upon differently by people, conspiracy theorists and all the rest of it, or was it more smooth than that?
Yeah, now I really don't have a lot to do with the other MPs in Parliament. I eat on my own, I speak on my own, and keep myself to myself. A few will reach out to me privately, but there are costs for even being seen speaking to me in the chamber of the House of Commons. I'm now separated and divorcing from my wife. She's divorcing me over this, and I've suffered quite a lot of personal financial loss. I was a multi-millionaire when I came into politics, and through various means, I shall probably, if I go out of it, I'll be going out pretty penniless, quite honestly. But I didn't sell my soul, and I had the opportunity. I was offered anything I wanted. I had to tell them what I wanted 2.5 years ago for my silence, and I didn't take it. I said, well, if that's what do you mean? I can have anything I want. And they said, you can have anything you want. You tell us what you want. And I said, well, if we're in that game, I said, I think the Prime Minister's resignation letter would be a good start. And that ended negotiations. And yeah, they've acted against me since then. But you can sell your soul anytime you want to, Alex, but you'll never be able to afford to buy it back. That's what I think.
Yeah, and we do see the footage of you. You know, when you post it of you standing talking in the chamber, and there's often commentary about the fact that there's no one there, or people walk out, or I mean, in our chamber sometimes those speeches happen at varying times, so there just aren't people in the chamber. But is it the case that people vacate and don't want to hear and walk out? And is that your experience?
Well, I'm normally given what we call the graveyard shift, so the last debate of the week when people are already heading for home. So there's always a perfect excuse why colleagues don't have to be there. But I mean, there's huge. When I'm going to give a big speech on one of these important issues, I put it out on my social media, and I know that every MP in this place will get emails from their constituents asking them to attend on their behalf. And it makes it very uncomfortable for them. They'd really rather I just wasn't about and had gone away, because then there wouldn't be anyone raising these difficult issues that they don't want to talk about. And I'm tremendously suspicious now of anything that our Parliament doesn't want to talk about. It doesn't want to talk about vaccine harms. It doesn't want to talk about excess deaths. In fact, the ONS, the Office of National Statistics, have just rebased the population calculations to get rid of most of the excess deaths. But they're happening in all other countries. I mean, the Republic of Ireland is being hammered. They're at 10% excess deaths month after month after month in Ireland. And they're even more heavily vaccinated than we are.
Just today, the Australian Bureau of Statistics reworked how they present excess mortality data to remove the 5-year baseline average. What do you say about that?
We're almost in lockstep, Alex. We're almost in lockstep, aren't we? Well, I mean, when the figures are inconvenient, then you have to change the figures, don't you? So, excess deaths, But ultimately, I mean, the rebasing in the UK wiped 20,000 premature deaths out of the excess last year. But very sadly, they can't hide the bodies. What we do know is that undertakers are very, very busy and have been busy since the pandemic. We should have actually have a deficit now. We've lost so many excess deaths throughout the pandemic and the years since, that because people can only pass once, and people who might have lived another 12 months or 6 months have passed prematurely, we should have a period where we have a deficit in deaths, less than expected deaths. Well, that's never happened, and that is very telling. So the deaths are continuing. It's mostly cardiac and stroke, and also we've now got a major uptick in cancer. Those are all explainable from the way that the vaccines work and what the inclusions were in them. And SV40, the simian virus 40 promoter agent, is clearly linked to cancer. It's been discovered by independent research, and that should have been enough to stop these experimental treatments being rolled out, but it hasn't.
What's I mean, just from a distance, what's your impression of the way in which Australia went through? I mean, were you seeing similarities in terms of the lockdowns and the responses across, if you were seeing it at all? But Australia's response across various states was pretty heavy. What was the impression from the UK?
Well, the impression for the UK is that we are all in lockstep, and it's a global problem needing a global solution. But the difference is that you're in the southern hemisphere, and I've heavily quoted data from Australia to make my arguments in the chamber of the House of Commons here, because of course you had the vaccines before you had any significant amount of COVID-19 infection in lots of your parts of the country. Because you did take severe lockdown measures, and what you saw was from May 2021, exactly the same as we saw in the UK, a major uptick in the incidence of cardiac and stroke. So you had excess deaths that could not be put down to infection with COVID, because you've got whole areas of your country that never had COVID. So, in a way, Australia, the evidence there is even more compelling than I can muster from the UK. And they can never answer these questions, and they never even attempt to answer these questions. They just try and smooth it all over and move on and smear.
Yeah, and in fact, we did that work out of this very office with Freedom of Information here in South Australia, looking at the presentations to cardiac wards, particularly between 20 and 40-year-olds, which coincided directly with the rollouts. So, I mean, and we didn't have any COVID at that stage at all. We didn't really until, I think, Christmas of 21. So the data was pretty compelling, but,
well, when you look at the science, of the way the vaccines are supposed to work and what we were told. So we were told that these novel treatments injected in the arm, and they stay in the arm and they're broken down there. Well, we know that's not true. It travels all over the body. And these mRNA treatments, they travel all over the body, mainly either through the lymphatic system or through the blood supply. And clearly, the lining of all the blood system is endothelial cells lining our veins, arteries, and those mRNA DNA genetic fragments, therapeutics inside the lipid nanoparticle coating will go through the cell wall into those endothelial cells lining our blood supply. It's going to go to the nucleus. It's going to make spike protein, which will then be shown on the outside of those cells, lining the blood supply. Our own antibodies then are going to recognize those cells as foreign, alien. They're going to attack them and destroy them. And when those cells lining blood supply, our arteries and veins, are attacked, that material then will burst into those arteries and veins, surrounded by lots of white blood cells and platelets. Alex, that's a blood clot. And if that blood clot then travels to the lungs, it will be a pulmonary embolism. And if it goes to the brain, it's going to be a stroke. And if it goes to the heart and blocks a major blood vessel there, you're going to have a heart attack. It's not hard to understand how these vaccines could induce exactly the excess deaths and incidence of cardiac problems and stroke that we've seen. That's the way they work. And they clearly have passed around our blood system, and it's inevitable that's what they will have done. It's not really O-level biology.
Yeah. It brings me to the topic of, what have we learned, but where we go from here in this WHO pandemic treaty, which I think is going to be voted on the 27th of May, but the build-up is happening in front of our eyes. Every time I ask the question of our health bureaucracy here or the politicians here, they say, it's nothing to worry about, we're not giving up our sovereignty. That's not my view. My view is here in Australia, we saw the ramifications of it through the Biosecurity Act here, which stopped Australians from going overseas as a result of our obligations under the international health regulations. But this is going to be bigger and badder. Tell us about the pandemic treaty. What's this going to go? And I assume the UK's official position is to vote for it.
It is, and I don't think you can look at the so-called pandemic, well, it was the treaty, the accord, and it's also called the pandemic agreement, although I'm not going to agree to it, and not on behalf of my constituents. But it's very hard to look at that instrument without also looking at the other instrument they're putting forward, which are the amendments to the International Health Regulations, last amended 2005. And it's very much, I think, two horses the WHO have got in this race, and they don't mind which one wins because they're going to take the powers one way or another. The only debates we've had in the UK Parliament, nobody wants to talk about the WHO issue. We just give them bland assurances that we're not giving up any powers or any sovereignty. They've only come from public petition-sponsored debates. We have a system in the UK where if over 100,000 electors sign a petition, the government has to consider it for debate. We had a debate on the treaty, and we had a debate on the amendment to the International Health Regulations. They were very sparsely attended by colleagues. We had another petition that reached over 100,000 and qualified for debate, calling for Parliament to debate withdrawal from the WHO and defunding it. And interestingly, the committee in charge of the petitions committee decided that that was not worthy of debate in our Parliament, despite having the right number of the public signing up for it. These are two terrible instruments there. The ramifications are enormous. If they go through in any form at all, it's going to change the relationship between the citizen and the state in every democracy around the world. It is a power grab by an unelected, unaccountable, non-tax-paying and diplomatically immune from prosecution organisation. What could possibly go wrong? There won't be a court anywhere in the world with the jurisdiction for you, me, or anybody else on the planet to object to anything that the Director General of the WHO does and inflicts upon us. It's a transfer of powers from sovereign governments to this organisation, the WHO, which is massively funded by external interests, many of them the same external interests who are interested in promoting the novel treatments and have profited from it. It's unbelievable that a country like UK that voted in 2016 to leave the European Union because it didn't want to give away sovereignty would even comprehend signing up to any of these instruments, because quite honestly, they make being a member of the European Union look like a paragon of democracy by comparison.
And it's really the sleeper issue, I think, too. We've got the same experience here. I mean, if you even mention WHO pandemic treaty in the halls of Parliament in Australia, you get looked at like you got four heads. It's bizarre. It's absolutely been swept under the rug, and it's you know, as you say, it's quite real and quite genuine. It takes me to the other issue. Another one of your favourite topics is digital ID. We've just passed a digital ID bill through our Senate. It's just gone through. It was rammed through without debate, if you don't mind, in the last day of a sitting period, along with a whole lot of other bills, just swept through. Not a big deal. Nothing to see here. But my concern, I'm sure yours is too, is the convergence of digital ID, central bank digital currencies, the surveillance state, and all of these powers turning together. Are you in the same lockstep of digital ID legislation coming through in the United Kingdom as well?
Yep, both the digital ID and the digital currency have been out to so-called consultation. I think we're on the edge of going into a digital trap of digital ID, digital currency, which of course will then allow people to be cancelled if you haven't got your vaccinations up to date under the WHO instructions, which bear in mind that there were recommendations, and they were bad recommendations during the last pandemic. They'll be mandatory if these instruments go through as they've been amended at the moment. And that just really doesn't bear thinking about. And if we get into this digital trap, it's going to be very, very hard to extract ourselves from it. Far better not to go into the trap. But again, as you've noticed in the Australian Parliament, and it's certainly true over here in the UK, this is another one of those issues that would be of great interest to the public, but there's no media coverage of it, and nobody wants to talk about it in Parliament at all. So it's just sort of sneaking through the back door. Tremendously dangerous.
And it does turn into this almost turnkey society where people wake up one day and realise the powers are already bricked in. We didn't know anything about it. We didn't hear about it. Well, many of us are out there raising the alarm bells now, and it's, as you say, great personal cost, by the way, as you well know. Online censorship, final topic I want to cover off on today is we've had a big debate in the last week about the manner in which the powers that have been given to a specific office here in Australia to pull down posts effectively, censor the internet, and there's a big debate going on about that. There are online censorship laws brewing in the United Kingdom, or have they passed already? But once again, a similar sort of phenomenon I understand happening over there too.
Yes, the online safety bill, which is, well, I think there is an old saying, isn't there, that anyone who's, you'll always be persuaded, they'll try and persuade you to give up freedom for safety. Well, anyone who's willing to give up their freedom for safety will get neither safety nor freedom, ultimately. It's all part of, the WHO treaty and the amendments to the international health regulations, they will have their Ministry of Truth, and during an emergency, they will have the ability to silence dissenting voices who go against the narrative. And we can remember how the lab leak versus zoonosis transfer between a pangolin and a human, that argument played out, and people were called conspiracy theorists for saying this is a lab-created virus. Well, I mean, the truth is that it certainly was, and there may well be others in the future. But that debate would have been shut down. So, I mean, this is tremendously dangerous. The European Union are also taking powers to police the internet themselves and to attack disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation, where malinformation is described as the truth but inconvenient. This is the absolute opposite of a free, open society and an open democracy. If we don't have freedom of speech, we have no other freedom, because all freedoms are based on the freedom to express your own views and dissent.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And it's, I mean, look, I think from those of us that have watched from the other side of the world, congratulations on taking the stand. I think history is going to sadly prove that you were 100% right. And it's a sad indictment on the manner in which parliaments go about it now these days, I have to say. But you have certainly done your bit. I know a lot of Australians have sort of looked at what you've been doing and with some great hope. So thank you for all the work you've done. And once again, we'll be watching with interest as you roll forward into the next little period. I don't know, any messages for Australians who might be listening here as to messages from the UK? It's like the home country.
Well, keep the faith. Ultimately, history is written by the victors, and for the sake of humanity and for our children and our grandchildren, the society we want them to grow up in and the opportunities we want to have, we have to win. And we have to fight in our own countries for our freedoms and rights, because as we can see, this is a worldwide problem. There's nowhere to run, so stand and fight for what you believe in.
Absolutely right. Andrew Bridgen, thank you so much. Thanks for coming on Based, and it's been great to chat.
All the best. Thank you for having me.